Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. By the way, be sure to join us on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. A visiting scholar at the Henry Salvatori Center at Claremont McKenna College, William Voegeli is a contributing editor to the Claremont Review of Books. His own new book, Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State. Bill Voegeli, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let me begin by quoting to you from Never Enough. There is no prospect that America's welfare state will become either a multiple or a fraction of what it is now.
Yes.
Why not?
There's a saying in politics that you either have big fights or you have nasty fights. I think in America we're not really having a big fight over the welfare state because most conservatives don't say but realize that it's not going to disappear. Most liberals don't say but realize it's not going to become like the Swedish social safety net. So the goalposts are fairly close together. But we have what we wind up with is a kind of narcissism of small differences. The relatively small amount of terrain between the absolute conservative and the absolute liberal position is fought over tenaciously. All right.
Segment one, by the numbers. How big was the welfare state before Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in easy-to-grasp for the layman terms, and how big is it today?
Yeah, it was America's welfare state was negligible prior to 1933, and it was not really that big even at the start of World War II. The good data coming from the Office of Management and Budget's historical tables unfortunately begins in 1940. And the press of financing First World War II and then the Korean War were such that it wasn't until 1954 that per capita constant dollar expenditures on human resources, this is the OMB's term, which means roughly what we mean by the welfare state, wasn't until 54 that they equaled the level they had been at in 1940. So you can really sort of start talking about the welfare state in the mid-50s. And you ask, how big is it today? Well, according to the historical tables going up through 2009, constant dollar per capita expenditures by the federal government on these five big areas: Social Security, all other federal programs for income support, Medicare, all other federal programs for health, such as Medicaid, health sciences, and all federal programs for education, job training, and social services. Those were 18.6 times as big in 2009 as they had been in 1954. So it's doubling every, I think, 18 years or so, something like that.
All right. Bill, draw a distinction. You've already started to do so. But draw a distinction in terms of size, magnitude, between the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, right, and about 3 decades later, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society.
The New Deal laid down markers, established political precedents, but I don't think it spent a great deal of money compared to the American experience prior to FDR's election in 1932. Compared to our baseline understanding of what the government does today, the New Deal operationally looks fairly modest. But the foundations for the building were laid then. The Social Security Act of 1935 established the basis for really the welfare state that has been built up since. Even Medicare is not legally a separate title, a separate piece of legislation, but an amendment to the 1935 Social Security Act. So
what happens? What happens with the Great Society?
The Great Society is when it's really from Johnson winning his election in '64 until about the mid-'70s, until, strangely enough, till Carter takes over, that there's this big surge of federal spending. Both under Johnson and then under Nixon and Ford, per capita constant dollar federal spending on human resources grows annually around 10% a year, give or take.
Staggering.
Yeah, and then partly because of political circumstances. You have Prop 13 and the tax revolt in 1978.
In California, the proposition which limited property taxes here in California and led to a wider tax revolt in the country.
That's right. So you have the, to borrow Peter Orszag's phrase, the growth curve bends a lot then. The welfare state grows, it continues to grow after this mid-60s to mid-70s surge, but at a much slower rate. Even under Jimmy Carter, the growth rate is more like 2 or 3% a year.
All right.
Much lower under Reagan.
What happens to defense spending as the welfare state grows?
It shrinks.
It shrinks in real terms or relative terms?
It shrinks in relative terms.
So to wrap up your description of the growth of the welfare state, simply describing it, not the rights or the wrongs, but to describe it, it is accurate to say that there are still old people alive in this country who were born into a nation in which the welfare state simply didn't exist. There are a lot of people, middle-aged in this country, who were born into a nation in which welfare spending was relatively modest and the principal spending effort by the federal government was defense.
Correct.
And then there are lots and lots and lots of people in their 30s or younger who, excuse me, I don't mean to say 30, but middle-aged people who have experienced this enormous expansion in spending, who have experienced the growth of the welfare state to be triple that of defense spending. But I'd almost suggest that it's happened so quickly that most Americans are only very dimly aware of it.
Yes. 2011, anyone under 45 years of age today, anyone born since 1965, has no real recollection of a country organized differently than the one we live in now.